Hello, this is Christian, and I'm joined today by my friend, college professor, and author, William Burns.
Hello, everyone.
And we're doing a video on our top 10 favorite Godzilla films besides the original. We both decided to exclude the original film from our list, and I can't speak for Bill, but for me, the original Godzilla, that's like my favorite film of all time, so that would have been way too easy. Now, I did do a video similar to this back in 2014 when the 2014 Godzilla film came out, and I did include the original on that list, but my list has changed since then. That video is still up, but this is sort of a new, revised version of that list in a way. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to focus on my list first, and Bill's, of course, going to commentate on some of the films on my list, and then he'll do his list. But before we get on to either of our lists, it would be a sin not to at least talk about the original Godzilla. Bill, what do you think of the original film?
I think it's an amazing film. One of the things I think that makes it so powerful is that Godzilla is not only Godzilla is a metaphor in that film as well as a character in that film as well. But I think he's more powerful and has more resonance through that metaphor of atomic destruction or just humankind trying to change their environment or change things, and it ends up having severe consequences for all of humanity.
One thing that kind of annoys me, but I kind of agree with, depending on which Godzilla film you're talking about, is a lot of people say, oh, you don't watch Godzilla for the human characters, you just watch it for the monster action, and it's like, with some of the Godzilla films, including some of the films on my list, I will say that is kind of true, but with the original Godzilla, you watch it for the human characters, because the original film is really a compelling human drama that just happens to feature a giant monster, and it's really not so much about the monster, rather it's really about the subtext of why the monster exists, and you could really tell that Ishiro Honda was a protege of Kurosawa, because it really does feel like a Kurosawa film that just happens to have a giant atomic monster.
Absolutely. I mean, you could see the attention to detail that Kurosawa put into his films, but also in Kurosawa's films, you really got the sense of consequences or the after effects of human decisions and choices. And I think that's another thing too in Godzilla, the original Godzilla, is that you don't only just feel for the characters we get to know, but even the masses in the film, even the characters we don't get to know, you feel such empathy for them because of the suffering they go through and the very realistic depictions of that suffering, which I think, of course, later on in the Godzilla films, you kind of lose that. But again, I think that you can focus on human characters, but you don't necessarily have to go into detail about each human character, but showing their suffering, showing what they're going through and the consequences of that suffering and of the disasters they're going through. That's what makes it human. It's not just necessarily the drama, but I think it's the empathy that you feel for the suffering and the hardship of the characters in the film, whether they're named or not.
And, like, one of the most powerful scenes in that original film for me is that scene where the little girl is crying over her dead mother who died in the hospital after Godzilla destroys Tokyo, and it's like, that's like something you would see out of a war drama or something. Like, you wouldn't expect that for a giant monster movie. Like, it literally feels like It almost feels like it's some biopic on Hiroshima rather than a movie about a giant lizard attacking a city. And that's what I love about that original film, is like, I love it when horror and science fiction films take themselves that seriously, and it's why it's my personal favorite. It's my favorite genre film, and it's my favorite film of any genre.
Well, it's funny you say that about the realism and the aspects of war and about Hiroshima, because a lot of times reading John Hersey's Hiroshima, his literary journalistic book about the aftermath of the atomic bomb dropping, a lot of the scenes in his book, when I visualize it, I see it in black and white, and I see it exactly how Ishiro Honda filmed his scenes of destruction in the original Godzilla.
In a lot of ways, I compare the original Godzilla more to movies like On the Beach or The Day After or even Doctor Strangelove than I do to other monster movies of the same kind. Like, to me, the original Godzilla really is a film about nuclear war. It just uses a monster as a metaphor for nuclear war, but to me it has more in common with those movies than stuff like Them or The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And because what's interesting about some of those 50 sci-fi films that were sort of those atomic age ones is that even though the monster is created through radiation, a lot of times it's destroyed through radiation. So there's not really a commentary there about sort of, you know, the dangers and the harm, because if something can be used to destroy it, then how can it be that bad? Whereas a Godzilla, right, we don't really have that, right? We have science destroying Godzilla, but in the sense it also destroys the creator as well.
Yeah.
You know, so again, we have this sort of fear of that science is something that we can't control. We can create, but we can't always control the consequences of what those are. And that becomes a real question in a lot of these later science fiction movies, right? Is this idea of what responsibility do the creators of this destructive science have? Do they have any? Is it just their job just to create something and just let society, you know, deal with it? Or do they have some kind of responsibility to their creations? You know, and you can find, this goes all the way back to Frankenstein, the novel Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I was about to compare the original Godzilla to something like Frankenstein, where you could really look at this as a story about the ethics of science.
Absolutely.
And the one thing, you kind of touched on this a little bit already, but one thing about the original Godzilla film that separates it from its counterparts in America is in an American monster film about nuclear radiation creating a monster, in the American films, they just use that as sort of a plot device. In Godzilla, they actually use that to make a legitimate political statement. Mm-hmm. And the original Godzilla really has a lot to say about the human condition. Absolutely. And the effects of war.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And that's what really raises it up into great art.
We could probably go on for hours about how great the original Godzilla is. I mean, a few years ago, we did an hour-and-a-half long video just talking about the original Godzilla. So, if you want to know more of our thoughts on that, just check out that video. But now we'll get on to our list of our top 10 favorite Godzilla sequels, which, with the exception of one Godzilla film, I don't think any of the sequels captured the power or the human drama of that original film.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're going to jump into my list, and I'm sure there's going to be overlap between our two lists here, but my number 10, and I don't know if I'm going to lose some credibility here because this does seem to be a rather polarizing Godzilla film, but it's one I enjoy because of just how batshit insane it is, and of course it's the complete polar opposite of the original Godzilla, which we just talked about, but my number 10 is Godzilla Final Wars, which I really just appreciate because of how insane the film is, and I appreciate it because the Millennium series I have a lot of problems with. In general, I think a lot of the films in that series were very bland, but this was one of the standouts of that series, in my opinion. But what do you think of this one?
Well, actually, it's on my list as well, so maybe I'll wait to discuss it when I get to my list, but I agree with a lot of what you said.
My number 9 is another pretty polarizing Godzilla film, and this is one where I can kind of understand why people don't like it, but I really enjoyed it, and that is Shin Godzilla from 2016. What I really liked about this one is I just liked how political it was. Like, it's probably one of the most political Godzilla films since probably Godzilla 1985, like, where the original Godzilla was making a commentary on Hiroshima, this is very much making a commentary on the Fukushima nuclear disaster from 2011 and the ineffectualness of the Japanese government to deal with that disaster. And the film really is a satire on Japanese bureaucracy. And I thought as a satire, it was very effective, but I can kind of understand if, like, you're not from Japan, and I'm not from Japan, obviously, but I can kind of understand how the satire maybe didn't work for people here in America, but I really appreciated Shin Godzilla. My only issue with the movie was the human characters were very, like, two-dimensional, and, like, if you watch the original film, which this film tried to emulate, the original film had interesting human characters. Again, they're very two-dimensional, but I'm willing to forgive that because I do appreciate this film a lot just because of how political it was, how it kind of returned Godzilla to what it was always meant to be. It's really meant to make a political statement. Godzilla in this movie is really a metaphor, and once again, this is really about the subtext of why Godzilla exists. But Bill, you haven't seen this one, have you?
No, I'm embarrassed to say I've not seen it, but the things I've read about it have been really fascinating, so I am looking forward to seeing it.
One thing about this one is the ending, it has an ending that's very much leaves it up to the viewer's interpretation, and while I want to see a sequel to it, at the same time, I'm kind of glad that there hasn't been a direct sequel to it, because I feel like that would kind of ruin that ambiguous ending. My number 8 is Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is the second film of the Heisei Godzilla series. What I like about this one is it has a premise that, if handled by another director, could have been really silly, because it's a silly premise. Basically, in the movie, Godzilla fights a giant flower created by a scientist who combined Godzilla's DNA with that of a rose's, but this giant flower monster is also possessed by the spirit of this scientist's dead daughter. Like, it's such an out-there premise, but what I like about it is it takes itself so seriously that you kind of buy the outlandish premise, and this one definitely seems to have a real anime influence to it, which I thought was really cool. But yeah, my number 8 is Godzilla vs. Biollante. Bill, what do you think of this one?
Actually, I enjoyed it very much. I think it's one of the most beautiful, out of all the Godzilla films, I think it's the most beautifully photographed. I think it's actually up there in terms of Japanese fantasy films, up there with Ishiro Honda's Mothra as one of the most beautiful, fantasy kind of, science, whatever you want to call this genre of films. But it's just beautifully photographed. And yeah, the premise, I like to see. I love Godzilla movies that are ambitious and try to sort of go outside the box and try to sort of do something different. I always heard that, I guess at the time, Mai the Psychic Girl or something, it was an anime or a manga thing, was a big influence on this film, because I guess that was big at the time in Japan. But yeah, I enjoyed this film very much. Although initially for Godzilla fans in the 90s at least, it was really hard to see this film. I think it was released.
I think HBO Video released it.
Right, yeah, and that was actually a hard videotape to even see. So I didn't see this movie until it eventually came out on DVD. But I loved it. I thought it was a really good movie.
Now, my number 7 is a movie that, if you see my old Top 10 Godzilla Movies video, I didn't include it, and I'm kind of kicking myself for not including it, because I think it's one of the most unique Godzilla films, and I decided to include it this time around, and that is Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, or GMK, which was the third film of the Millennium series, and this and Final Wars are like the only two films of that series that really did something unique and different, and this is a very unique Godzilla film because it really incorporates like the mystical and the supernatural, where in the film Godzilla is possessed by the spirits of dead Japanese soldiers, and like King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Baragon are literally gods who are defending Japan from Godzilla, who is more or less a demon in this movie. Like, it's such a cool idea, and it's also a Godzilla film that's very political. It's very much making a statement about Japan's imperial past and how Japan has kind of forgotten the horrors that they've done to other countries, like the horrors they inflicted on other countries, I mean. It's just such a powerful Godzilla film, and it's also, there is a lot of satire in it. There's a lot of humor in the film that, when I first saw the film, I didn't think really worked, but looking at it now, I think the satire actually works very well in the film. But Bill, what do you think of this one?
Well, it's actually on my list, so I will reserve my comments to when I get to it on my list.
All right. My number 6 is Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, or Ebirah Horror of the Deep. I'm going to call it Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster because that's the title I primarily know it as, and this is one that I know a lot of Godzilla fans don't like, but I've always had a lot of fun with this one, and this is one where I actually really like the human characters, especially Akira Takarada's character in the film, who's a criminal in the beginning. In here, like, you see this character go through a real arc throughout the film, and I just think it's a lot of fun. It's just like, Of a lot of the Showa Godzilla films, it's one of the ones I consider to be the most fun. What do you think of this one?
Well, I mean, I enjoy it, but I definitely think it's a second tier for me, a second tier Godzilla movie. It kind of represents for me the sort of mid-60s kind of like a sort of lapse in the Godzilla films, like Son of Godzilla, the Sea Monster. I kind of like put those together in my mind. But it's an enjoyable film. I just don't think it has the power or even the sheer lunacy of some of the other films that I really love.
All right. Now, my number 5 is Destroy All Monsters. Now, this is an example of a Godzilla movie that I love, but the human characters really are very flat in this movie. This is an example where I'll agree with some Godzilla fans who only watch these movies for the monster action. This is an example of where I do just watch it for the monster action, but I still really, really love this movie. I think it's one of the best, of the original Godzilla series, the Showa era, I think this is one of the best of the series. What do you think of this one?
Oh, well, it's on my list, so I will reserve my comments for that.
Number 4 on my list is Godzilla vs. Gigan, which is very maligned by a lot of Godzilla fans, but I actually really, really love this one. Maybe it's just nostalgia, I'm not sure, but I don't know, I really don't think of this as a bad Godzilla movie. Yes, it has the scene where Godzilla and Anguirus talk, which is just bizarre, but that doesn't bother me with this movie. I actually like the tone of the movie. While it is a silly movie, there are moments of the film that are actually kind of dark, and I actually think there is a compelling mystery in the film where the main characters are trying to figure out what's going on with this corporation that's built in this children's land, and when you find out that the main villains are these, alien cockroaches, I actually thought their backstory was pretty compelling, and I like how the main character of the movie is a manga artist. You don't usually see something like that in a Godzilla movie because in the movie he does monster mangas, and it's almost like he's trapped in one of his own mangas, which I thought was a really cool idea, but yeah, I love Godzilla vs. Gigan. I also think Gigan is a really cool monster, and I could even forgive the scene where Gigan and King Ghidorah are flying and they're clearly puppets. I can forgive that, maybe because I saw the movie when I was so young, and I could even forgive a lot of the stock footage that's used in the film. It doesn't bother me. I really, really love this movie, and this is one where I can just, watch it anytime. I have it on VHS, and I've pretty much worn out the VHS by now because there are times, before I go to bed, I just pop this movie in. What do you think of this one?
Well, I guess it's not as maligned as you think because it's also on my list, too.
My number 3 is Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, the original one from the Showa era, and I think this is, of the 70s Godzilla films, I think this is the best of the 70s Godzilla films, and of Jun Fukuda's Godzilla films, I think this is probably his best work. This is another one that actually has a lot of similarities to Godzilla vs. Gigan, because in the movie, it turns out Mechagodzilla is controlled by aliens, but I like how there's sort of this mystical element with King Seesaw, or King Caesar, or however you want to say his name. This is one that I just find to be a lot of fun. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I enjoy it too. Again, there are other Godzillas from the 70s that I like better, but I certainly do like it. I love the fact that it's was in Okinawa, I believe part of it is, so you have, again, that sort of more mystical, folkloric, kind of spiritual kind of aspect to it. I also like the music, because the music when they're on Okinawa and when they're doing the rituals and chants, I think are actually based on indigenous musics of Okinawa, of the people of Okinawa. But yeah, it's a fun movie. It's definitely 70s. It definitely has kind of that spy kind of aspect to it as well. But yeah, I enjoy it too, and I love the Mechagodzilla movies, and I'll talk about the other one from the 70s on my list.
All right. My number 2 is King Kong vs. Godzilla, but specifically the American cut. I've seen the Japanese cut, which is more of a comedy and a satire, and to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the Japanese cut of this movie, and maybe it's my nostalgia talking, because this was actually my first Godzilla movie, but the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla I adore. It's the one that really got me into the Godzilla franchise in general, and I just really, really love this movie, but specifically the American cut. Again, the Japanese cut, I'm not really a big fan of. Maybe the satire just doesn't work for me. I mean, I get what the satire was going for, but it didn't do anything for me. But the American cut, which is more of a generic monster movie, I really enjoy. What do you think of the American cut of this one?
Well, great minds think alike, because I'm going to talk about that on my list as well.
All right. And my number one favorite Godzilla sequel is 1984's The Return of Godzilla, or Godzilla 1985, as it was known here in the States. And I think of all the Godzilla sequels, this is the one that comes the closest to the original in terms of tone and in terms of what the film is trying to say. It's actually a very political movie, where the original Godzilla was making a commentary on post-World War II Japan and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This one's very much making a commentary on the nuclear arms race and the Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union that were going on when this movie came out. But again, I just love this one because of how political it is, because of how dark it is. It's not as hard-hitting as the original film, but still, this is definitely one of my favorite Godzilla. It is my favorite Godzilla sequel, and I think it's the best of the Godzilla sequels. And now, there are two cuts of this movie. There's the original Japanese cut, and then when it came over to the States, it was re-edited as Godzilla 1985. I personally prefer the 1985 cut, but that's only because that's the version of the movie I grew up on. It was actually my second Godzilla film that I saw right after King Kong vs. Godzilla, and I still have the VHS of Godzilla 1985, and it's another one like Godzilla vs. Gigan that I sometimes find myself watching over and over again. But again, technically the Japanese cut is superior, but I recommend both versions of this movie. Like, it is a very powerful Godzilla film, but what do you think of this one, either cut?
Well, to be honest, I think I have a unfair prejudice against this film. As a young Godzilla fan, I remember it coming onto cable, and I'm being so excited to see it, and being very disappointed, because up to that point, my experience of Godzilla had been watching the 60s and 70s Godzilla films where, you know, there were lots of monsters and lots of fighting, and it was very much geared towards children. So to see a film that was more adults and focusing on adults and a lot of talking, a lot of drama, was very confusing to me. So I did not like this film initially when I saw it. Subsequently, this was a hard film to actually see. So I held on to that prejudice for a long time until I recently saw it on DVD, and I realized, wow, this was a really amazing film, very powerful film. I admire it for trying to bring back to the series a more sort of somber, a more serious tone. But to be honest, I mean, if I'm reaching for a Godzilla film to watch, I'm probably not reaching for this one right away.
I do want to point out that I absolutely love the score for this one. It's actually one of my favorite scores of any Godzilla film. And I actually think this is one of the most well-made Godzilla films. Like, a lot of the effects work in this movie, I actually think still hold up today. Some of it doesn't really hold up, but a lot of it I actually think really does. Like, this is also probably my favorite look for Godzilla of any of the films. But yeah, I absolutely love both cuts of this movie, but again, on a personal level, I do kind of prefer Godzilla 1985. The one thing, though, is if you watch the Japanese cut, it's making a commentary on the tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, but it doesn't really pick a side in that version. In the American cut, they very much gear it towards the Americans, where the Americans are the good guys and the Soviet Union are the bad guys. But still, I really do enjoy both versions, and I know I'm a broken record at this point.
Okay, everyone. Well, my list is going to start with Godzilla Final Wars. That's my 10th favorite Godzilla sequel. I agree with a lot of the things that Christian said. I mean, I remember being so excited for this movie to come out because it was going to be the culmination of the whole Godzilla series. And then watching the film, it kind of reminded me, like, if you asked a 15-year-old in 2004 to make the ultimate Godzilla film, I'm imagining this is what the person would have came up with. It's like you throw everything about Godzilla into a pot, add some Matrix, and then you get Godzilla Final Wars. But I really enjoyed it. I wasn't expecting a somber farewell. I was expecting a sort of battle royale type film, and that's just what you get. I mean, Monster X was awesome. Kaiser Ghidorah was awesome. The final battle between them in a sort of a ruined landscape is like, was just great. It was really exciting. And again, I understand how people could see this as being kind of goofy and also being, mimicking some of the sort of like the bullet time kind of Matrix-esque kind of special effects. But again, I thought the film was really entertaining and I enjoyed it. And I thought it was a fitting end to the series. But I guess it wasn't a fitting end to the series because, of course, Shin Godzilla came out.
Yeah, not just Shin Godzilla, but then the American ones, too.
Right, that's true.
One thing I really do like about this one also is I actually really like the main villain. He's so over the top and silly, but I really do like the main villain. I like how he's almost like this bratty teenager, which is funny because he's supposed to be an alien. He's supposed to be some superior being, yet he acts like a freaking, bratty 16-year-old kid or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the way he dresses with like the sunglasses and everything, But yeah, it was, like I said, it's not to be taken seriously, but at least it was exciting. It was entertaining. We got to see a lot of monsters. We got to see the American Godzilla get his comeuppance in the film as well. Yeah. So again, I enjoyed this film very much.
And I agree with you about the Matrix influence on this film. Another sci-fi property that I see having an influence on this is the miniseries V, if you remember that
yes,
miniseries.
Absolutely.
It has a lot of similarities to that
sure.
in terms of the plot.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I loved V when I was a kid. That was a big deal in the 80s. Well, my ninth favorite is Terror of Mechagodzilla from 1975. This was the last film, I believe, in the Showa series, and I think they wanted to go out with a more serious film because the films before this had been very much geared towards children, had been very much more sort of looking for entertainment rather than story. And this film, they tried to bring a more serious tone to it. And also, it was Ishiro Honda's last film, I believe. I think it's the last film, not only that in his last Godzilla film he ever directed, but I believe it might have been his last film he directed, period.
I know he did, some work with Kurosawa after this. I think he, was an assistant director on Kurosawa's Dreams.
Right. But in terms of his last, film that he was actually the director on. So I guess because he had started the series, they were looking to him to sort of bookend it and sort of, come to the culmination of the series. And again, I thought this film very much is, again, entertaining. I liked the seriousness of the film. I also thought the love story in the film was interesting too, about where the protagonist falls in love with this woman and he finds out that she's actually an android. So I thought that was an interesting twist to put into a Godzilla film, because usually the love stories in Godzilla films I thought were always very trite, very almost sick, too sweet in the film. So this one was a little bit more, had a little bit more pathos in it.
Yeah, and what I like about this one is it still has some of the goofy stuff that you saw in some of the previous Godzilla films, but you could tell this was Honda trying to return the series to its roots. And I do like this one, but I don't know, it feels kind of dull to me compared to the ones leading up to this. I personally prefer the first Mechagodzilla movie, but that's just me personally.
I also think this film is a little bit more violent than the other ones. I think they wanted to do a little bit more maybe get more adults to see it, so I think there's more, a little bit more violence in the film, more realistic violence, I should say. I also love the shots of Titanosaurus, where they're from the bottom looking up at him to make him even look even bigger. So again, I thought this film did try some different things. Some of it was successful, some of them not successful, but I like the fact that Honda was still trying to perfect his art and stretch his sort of vision even right up to the end. Eighth on my list of my favorite Godzilla sequels is Godzilla Mothra Battle for Earth from 1992. I don't know, there's something about Mothra that brings out the best in Japanese directors. I think that Ishiro Honda's initial Mothra film is one of the most beautiful fantasy films ever made. But there's something about Mothra that just makes directors in Japan really, I think, bring out the beauty and the spectacle of the kaiju film that is inherent in the kaiju film. Because I think, obviously when we think of giant monsters, we think of the danger, the attacks, the violence, the destruction. But on the other hand, a giant monster could be beautiful. It's a wondrous spectacle. I think Mothra really sort of brings that out. So I really enjoyed Godzilla. Out of all the Godzilla Mothra team ups, my favorite is this one from 1992. I really like the sort of environmental message in the film. I liked it. It seemed to me a much more feminine film, focused more on the female characters in the film as well. And this also started the Mothra series. I think this movie was so popular in Japan in 1992.
Yeah,
that
they did. They had the Rebirth of Mothra movies after this.
Right. So again, to me, this is I love out of all the Mothra films, and I think in all the Godzilla series, Mothra has had some sort of connection with Godzilla, even with the new one that's coming out now this summer. But to me, this is the best one. It's the most spectacular one. It's the one that's the most feminine, and it's also the most beautiful as well.
I do like this one, but it's probably my least favorite of the Heisei era. I don't know why. This one doesn't really appeal to me like the other ones do. I personally find the environmentalist message to be a little too on the nose. This one doesn't really appeal to me like it does to you. I know a lot of Godzilla fans love this one. I know it is a fan favorite, and I think of the Heisei era, I think this was actually the highest grossing one, but yeah, this one just doesn't really do it for me, but maybe it's because the VHS I have is a really, really bad dub of the movie, so maybe that's why I have some unfair prejudice towards it, kind of like with you in Godzilla 1985, where the dub-in on my VHS copy is pretty god-awful, so maybe that's kind of coloring the film for me. I will say I think Mothra looks great in the movie, like, just the effects work in this movie is actually pretty spectacular, I would say.
Absolutely. And Batra's a great character, too.
Oh, yeah. Batra's a really cool villain who turns out to be, spoiler alert, not really a villain by the end. Yeah, Batra is an interesting character.
Yeah, so this film, again, I'm a big Mothra fan, and this is my favorite teaming of Godzilla and Mothra. Okay, so my seventh favorite Godzilla sequel is Godzilla vs. Gigan from 1972. I agree with a lot of the things that Christian said about this film. I love the look of Gigan, very strange design, but somehow it works in the film. I really like the characters as well. I like the mystery part of it. It was almost like a Scooby-Doo episode or something, with them getting together to find out what's really going on here. I really like the Godzilla building that they had for the thing. That's kind of neat too. So again, I really enjoyed it as a child, but I can still enjoy it now. I don't think it really is juvenile in any way. It's just it takes what's great about Godzilla and makes it more appealing, I guess, to children and to people that might not know as much as the background of Godzilla as being this metaphor. But it's still very entertaining. I also really like the soundtrack. I know that's also controversial because there's not a lot of original music to this. Because at the time, I guess, of the energy crisis and a downturn in the Japanese film industry, they were cutting corners for a lot of these films. So what they did was, for the soundtrack, they actually took pieces of prior soundtracks of other Toho films and put it together. So you almost get like this kind of Akira Ifukube kind of greatest hits. You hear like music from other Godzilla movies. You hear music from War of the Gargantuas. You hear music from Frankenstein Conquers the World. So it's kind of cool that it's almost like this mishmash of music, but it really works for the film.
I do want to point out, I really do love the hippie character in the movie, the one who has the corn cob and is like, he must have thought it was a gun. I always reference that. That's like one of my favorite scenes in any movie. I also like how the main character, you actually brought this up when we talked about this movie in our retrospective on the Showa era that we did a few years ago. You brought up how he is kind of a feminine character in a way, even though he's male. Mm-hmm. Like, there's even that one point where his girlfriend asks him, "Are you a man?"
Well, I actually heard that was actually reflected. It's funny because you reflected the whole thing. Well, he's a manga artist, and the whole kind of manga-esque, feel of the film is that supposedly that's almost a stock character in manga writing, that of the effeminate kind of male character and the more masculine female character kind of challenging him to be more of a man. So that's interesting that actually came out in this film as well, but that's almost the stock character in manga.
And I actually do find, I talked about this a little bit already when I talked about it on my list, but I find the villains to be actually kind of sympathetic if you really think about their backstory. They're just really looking for another home. Mm-hmm. Obviously, their way of doing it is wrong because they're going to wipe out a whole race just so they can have a home. But being that, they had their world destroyed previously, you kind of get where they're coming from.
Yeah, and I think there's also that kind of, again, that environmental kind of message as well, where you're not hit over the head with it, like let's say in Godzilla vs. Hedorah or Godzilla and Mothra Battle for Earth. But yeah, I think that you could even see, I think a lot of times some Godzilla fans see these 70s films as having no redeeming value, whatever. But they were trying to do something. They were trying to make a comment on environmentalism. They were trying to make these sort of commentary, maybe for a younger audience that needed it to be introduced to these things, whereas the older audiences might sort of be too jaded, where maybe a younger audience would sort of take this to heart.
I do think it's funny, like, I mentioned how I don't really mind the stock footage in the film, but as an adult, it can be kind of off-putting to see Godzilla clearly looking different when you see him. Like, they use some stock footage from, I think, either Godzilla vs. Mothra, the original one, or Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, where it's clearly a different Godzilla suit, so it is a little jarring to see Godzilla's head all of a sudden change shape, but that still doesn't bother me to a point where I'm like, oh, the movie sucks, you know?
Right, yeah, me too. I like continuity, but I don't need to have, like, you know, such a strict continuity. Sixth on my list of favorite Godzilla sequels is GMK, Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, from 2001. And, of course, the director, Shusuke Kaneko, I believe his name is, he had actually really revitalized and reinvented the kaiju, film with his Gamera series, where he brought back Gamera and made it much more up to date. He made it much more serious.
And I maintain that those are probably the best Gamera films, because to be honest, I'm not really a big Gamera fan. I personally find Gamera to be kind of the poor man's Godzilla. But the 90s Gamera series is actually really damn good.
Absolutely. And I think he really brought that mentality to Godzilla, to the Godzilla, and it really shows in this film.
Yeah, I know in your book on horror films, you talk about this movie, and you call this the most Lovecraftian Godzilla film.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the fact where the different kaiju are actually worshipped as gods. Now, are they gods or not? We don't know. But obviously, it would make sense that sort of primitive peoples, the indigenous peoples, would look to these creatures and think that they were godlike. So, I think this film is really good. I also think it's very close to the tone of Honda's original. There's that part where the kids are they're in school and they look outside and they can see like the explosion. It's almost like a mushroom cloud outside. Yeah. So again, I think that Kaneko does a nice job of sort of alluding to those kind of things that Honda did.
More or less, because there is still some comedy in this film. And what do you think of the comedy? Like the scene where you see Baragon in the background and then the wife is like, oh, take a picture with me with Baragon in the background. Like, what do you think of scenes like that?
I can understand what he was going for with those, but some of those do fall flat now, I think. But again, I admire ambition. I admire people who bring a new vision, something more than just sort of going along with the sort of rules of these type of films and trying something different. So I'm much more open to these kind of things, even though some of them might fall flat. But in the sense that I think that Kaneko gets much more right about this film than he gets wrong. And I love the look of Godzilla in this film. He's got to be one of the most frightening Godzillas with those white eyes. So yeah, I really I love this film in the sense that it's probably my favorite in the Millennial series because of the new things that were tried here. They actually went out on a limb. They actually experimented with some things, and I think it was a success.
Yeah, and I kind of wish more of the Millennium Godzilla films were like this. Like, personally, I think this should have been one where they did a direct sequel to it or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, I'm not sure if this was an influence, but I also see some Junji Ito in the film. I can see, like, some connections with Junji Ito, the manga artist and writer Junji Ito, with some of his works. Christian and I have been talking about if Junji Ito ever worked on a Godzilla film, how amazing that would be. My number 5 favorite Godzilla sequel is Godzilla vs. Megalon. Now I know this is another one that has really is quite controversial in the Godzilla fandom. There are people who hate this one, and there are people who love this one, and I am on the side of the people who love this one. I love Jet Jaguar. I love the Megalon himself. When Megalon first appears on Earth, when he's like knocking down the dam and everything, I think that's some really great miniature and special effects works. I know people hate the score, but again, maybe because of nostalgia, I love the score to this. But again, I think it's a fun movie. I know there's parts where they're wrestling and it looks like they're wrestling and doing all these crazy
drop kick.
Yeah, but something, it's fine. I can take, and that's what's great about Godzilla. You can have movies that are like the original, that are totally serious, totally have a somber tone. And then you have films like Godzilla vs. Megalon, where it's fun. It's not meant to be taken seriously. It's meant to be an escapist. It's meant to be fantasy, you know, that who doesn't want to see these monsters fighting in this way? So again, maybe it is nostalgia for me, seeing this as one of the first Godzilla movies I ever saw, but I still love it. It still entertains me, and I feel that it's one of the ones that really need to be reappraised.
Yeah, I agree with you on this one. It didn't make my list, but it's a fun movie. Like, it's one where, like, I totally get why people don't like it, because technically speaking, it is pretty bad, but I have fun with this one. I really do. And MST3K did a great episode on this one. Push the original Godzilla film out of your mind. This is a fun kids film, because it is a movie for children.
Very much so. And, I mean, it does talk about nuclear blast stuff, so you can make a loose connection to the original if you want to.
My only issue with this one, but this isn't really the movie's fault, and you could say this about the 70s Godzilla films in general, is this is what people who don't really take Godzilla that seriously point to, and it's like, that's one thing that annoys the crap out of me. It's like, don't just judge Godzilla based on a movie like this. If you watch that original film, you'll be shocked at how dark it is. And, like, I will say, like, when they were making the original Godzilla film, I can only imagine what it would have been like if they somehow found out that this is what the series would eventually become. But again, I have a lot of fun with this one as well.
Yeah, I enjoy it very much. All right, fourth on my list of favorite Godzilla sequels is Destroy All Monsters from 1968. First of all, the title is amazing. Like, that's like one of the greatest film titles, I think, in the history of cinema. It's such a great title. I remember when I first became a Godzilla fan and, you know, getting books out of the library that had, like, lists of Godzilla movies. And this is one I wanted to see so badly. I remember just being a younger and just scanning the TV guide each week, hoping that this movie would be on, and then finally seeing it and it being just as great as I thought it was going to be. Now, I do agree with Christian in that some of the human stuff does fall flat and is a little bit boring, but the monster scenes more than make up for it, and even the scenes like on the moon, and there's some really great effect shots that have nothing to do with the monsters. So, Destroy All Monsters was just like, you know, it's just this great monster rally. I know it does bother me that at one point they call Gorosaurus Baragon. That kind of bothered me in the film. But anyway, it's really great. I always heard that they were thinking that this might be the culmination of the series. Yeah. Right? If that Toho was looking at this as the final movie. If it had been, I think it would have been a great send-off, and it would have been a great, culminating part to the series. But again, just because of all the monsters together, just because, it's the sort of, 60s science fiction, it's one of the great 60s science fiction films, I love Destroy All Monsters.
And I agree. I think it's a really fun movie, but of course this was on my list already.
Third on my list of favorite Godzilla sequels is King Kong vs. Godzilla, and as Christian said, the American cut from 1962. Again, I've seen both cuts. I've seen the Japanese cut and the American cut, and I agree with Christian that the Japanese cut, although might be more satiric, might be more intellectual, might be more insightful in some ways about sort of commercialization and sort of the westernization of the Japanese culture, I do enjoy the American cut more. It's more exciting. It's sort of, it streamlines the film, I think, in some good ways, if you're looking for pure entertainment over something that's more sort of satiric and more thought-provoking. I mean, King Kong gets drunk in it. I mean, there's just like this great series, and the fight at the end, it totally, because a lot of times with films, they'll build up a fight between two great characters, and the fight kind of never sort of meets your expectations or kind of is not as good as you thought it was going to be. But I thought the fight between Godzilla and King Kong was great in this film, and the effects in this film are great. The miniatures, really, Sarabe's,
Eiichi
Tsuburaya's special effects work in this film is amazing. And I know a lot of people put down the King Kong suit in the film, but I think it looks great. I think it looks really cool.
I have no problem with the King Kong suit myself. I think it looks better than it did in King Kong Escapes, which was the other Toho King Kong film.
Right. And I think I think this is one of the great Godzilla suits as well.
Oh yeah, this is probably my second favorite Godzilla design next to his design in Godzilla 1985.
Right.
At least of the Showa era, this is probably my favorite Godzilla suit.
Yeah, it looked great. And again, it's being a child who's into monsters. Any movie where King Kong, the American super monster versus Godzilla, the Japanese super monster, that is like, that's like a heavyweight battle. It's like the two greats going at each other, and it was really good. And it's a satisfying film. I didn't feel that that I was disappointed or let down by any aspect of this film. I really enjoy it. I still enjoy it now.
Yeah, I do want to point out, I do find the human characters to be pretty entertaining in this one. This scene is in both the Japanese cut and the American cut, but the scene where, like, they just give the cigarettes to the natives all willy-nilly, and then he's like, it's okay, they're all smoking.
I like the part, and also with the octopus.
Oh, yeah.
That part's cool, too.
Oh, that's one of my favorite scenes in any kaiju film, and that scene was kind of paid homage to in Kong Skull Island.
Right.
Where King Kong fought the giant octopus.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I always heard a story that supposedly Tsuburaya, he ate the octopus afterwards.
Yeah,
that they used the octopus an actual octopus in the shot, and then supposedly he ate the octopus afterwards.
Why not?
Yeah, sure. My second favorite Godzilla sequel is Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah from 1991. Not only for the film itself, because I think the film itself is a really well-made film, but at the time, during the early 90s, being a Godzilla fan, I mean, obviously the internet was not, I didn't have the internet at the time, and so finding out about these films was hard. They were not covered in mainstream media, so finding out about these films was hard. So I didn't find out that it was even a Heisei series until like 1994. So all of a sudden, to find out there were all these Godzilla films, I was like, oh, wow, So you had to get like bootleg tapes, or like, they would be, or hunt down the actual releases themselves, the legitimate releases. But I remember seeing the first of the Heisei series that I saw, outside of Godzilla 1985, we'll leave that aside for a second, but was Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and just being so impressed with the film. That there was this, it was an ambitious film. They tried to, really sort of reinvent Godzilla. They had the time travel aspects of it. It was a very ambitious film, which really blew me away. I thought it was done really well. It was like almost like mature sci-fi. It really moved away from some of the more sort of childish kind of aspects of the at the end of the Showa series. But again, I thought the special effects was so impressive. I thought that it could rival any American film in terms of science fiction at the time. So I was just so impressed with it, and I thought it was a great story. I liked the characters in it. I thought the monster scenes, the fight scenes were amazing. And then at the end, when like Mecha King Ghidorah comes out, it was great. It was like this kind of sci-fi spectacle that I always wanted to see from Godzilla and finally received.
And you see, I do like this one, but I kind of find this one to be somewhat overrated among Godzilla fans. I kind of feel like a lot of Godzilla fans kind of overpraise this one. I do think it's good, but there's a lot about this movie that I do find to be very goofy, and there's also a lot of huge plot holes in the film, and granted, that's almost inherent with time travel, but still, they erase the original Godzilla from existence, yet people still remember the original Godzilla, and they still reference the stuff that happened in the Godzilla films previous to this one in the later Godzilla films. So there's a lot of plot holes that are never properly addressed in this movie. And again, I do like the film, but I do have problems with it, and I personally find it to be somewhat overrated, but that's just me.
Again, I think maybe if I had came to it later, but again, being that this was the first film that I saw in the Heisei series, well, first of all, I couldn't believe that the new Godzilla movies were being made, and then seeing this film and being like, whoa, this is really, it's not just a Godzilla film, it's like a really well-made film with Godzilla in it, which I think was a difference. Whereas some of the later Showa movies, to me, first and foremost, it was a Godzilla movie, and if it was entertaining afterwards, okay. But I was older at the time. I guess I was like in my late teens, early 20s at this time, seeing this film and being like, wow, Godzilla could still be relevant. Godzilla can still be something that I enjoy even into my, adulthood, and it's not something I have to put aside with the rest of, childhood stuff. Okay, so my number one favorite Godzilla sequel is Godzilla vs. Hedorah from 1971. Another film that is very controversial in Godzilla fandom, but I love it. I think it takes the seriousness and the goofiness and sticks them both into one film. It takes the greatness of both those kind of things and puts them both together. I love the mixture of like animation and documentary and fiction. I just think it works so well. It's like, for the longest time, you had sort of like older men, post World War II. Honda, I guess, had lived through World War II, and all of a sudden you have in 1971 you have this hippie come along and make a Godzilla film, and they have there's acid rock on the thing. They go to like nightclubs, they have like a festival, almost like a Woodstock like festival, and Godzilla's put into this. So I love it. I love crazy Japanese films. I love crazy films to begin with, but this one I think is amazing. I love the fact that there is a seriousness to it because it has a strong environmental message about pollution and about industrialization. But on the other hand, it has all this like goofy stuff in the film as well. So again, I think it's an amazing film. I love the mixture of genres. I love that it took the Godzilla idea and pushed it way past what anybody else expected, and I admire that. I admire that ambition, and I find it so entertaining, and every time I see the film, I find something else. It's just a film that is just so loaded with details. It's a film that I love as a film, even outside of if I wasn't a Godzilla fan.
Yeah, and this is one that I think I appreciate more than I really like. Like, I do like the film, don't get me wrong, but it's probably my least favorite of the 70s era. Like, when I watch a 70s Godzilla film, I could pop in Godzilla vs. Gigan, or Godzilla vs. Megalon, or Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla almost any time. This is one that I really have to be in a specific mood to watch. But I do appreciate this one. This is definitely, I think, one of the most unique Godzilla films, but it's not one of my personal favorites.
You can either give it credit or blame to Yoshimitsu Banno, I believe, who directed it, and I just think he brought this like hippie ethos like to the genre, and I love it. I think it's really great. I know he also wrote the screenplay for another environmental kind of like disaster film, the Prophecies of Nostradamus: Last Days on Earth, which actually became quite controversial because in the film they show like in the future, like they show like people who are affected by radiation from like nuclear wars, and they're all like kind of like deformed mutants. And I guess like support groups for people who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki sort of saw that as a sort of like an insult to them. So actually, the film's been pulled from distribution. So, but the director of Godzilla vs. Hedorah wrote the screenplay for that too. So you could tell it definitely has this 70s end of the world vibe to it. And again, I just love it. I love the fact that it's something different. It's something that's totally outside what people expected for a Godzilla film. I'm imagining it probably did horribly at the box office. I'm imagining that it had all sorts of criticism from the brass at Toho. But again, I admire it because of it's so different and it's so unlike everything else. And that Godzilla here almost becomes a metaphor again, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Well, not so much Godzilla. I would say
I'm sorry.
Hedorah really becomes
absolutely,
the metaphor.
You're right. I'm sorry. Yes, Hedorah is the actual metaphor here.
I know the producer of the Godzilla movies, Tomoki Tanaka, absolutely despised this movie, and he told Banno, "You will never direct another Godzilla movie."
But see, that to me shows that he did something right. When you have the sort of the institution, something like Toho, which was such a conservative institution. When you have somebody telling you that they hate your movie and that it goes against the sort of the studio ethos itself, I don't know. To me, that says you did something right.
Now, real quick, I think we should go through some honorable mentions, like Godzilla films we really like that just didn't make our list. My honorable mention would probably be the original Godzilla vs. Mothra, which I actually think is pretty close to the original in terms of its social message, because there is a real environmentalist message that I think was done better in that one than it was later on in the 90s version, and there's also a message about the importance of journalism and about corporate greed. But yeah, Godzilla vs. Mothra, or Mothra vs. Godzilla, which is the proper title, I think, is definitely a really good Godzilla film. It's one where I do have to be in a specific mood to watch it, but it is a good one.
Yeah, I agree. I like that one a lot as well, okay? But again, I'm going to go out on another limb and say my honorable mention is Godzilla's Revenge, or also known as All Monsters Attack. Again, this is purely coming from nostalgia. I believe it was the first Godzilla movie I ever saw, and I loved it. I mean, it had a kid was like the main character who like daydreamed about monsters and fantasized about these kind of creatures and things like that. So I guess I can identify with it from that aspect, and I thought it was great. I loved the whole thing with like with Minya. And the father teaching Minya, making him tough and everything like that. I just thought it was a great and also like that being mirrored with the little boy who's being bullied. you know, and then you have like this weird like kidnapping plot thrown in there, and the guy's friend is a toy maker and stuff like. It's just like it's like a little boy's dream come true for a movie. So that's why I love it.
And it also has a great message at the end where he joins the gang.
Yes, good for him.
I hate this one, but I hate it, but I get why somebody like you would like it. Like, I've gained a greater appreciation of this over the years, but it's still probably my least favorite Godzilla film, but I totally get why you like it.
And Honda directed it, right? I think I'm sure Honda directed it.
I actually, another honorable mention would be, I know this is one you're not crazy about, but I actually really like Godzilla vs. Monster Zero or Invasion of Astro Monster. Like, I really like Nick Adams' character in that movie. I think him and Akira Takarada have great chemistry in the film. I actually really like that one, and actually my old video on this, that actually was on my list back when I did this list originally.
I really like the look of that film. I think the look of it, the special effects, the costumes, the designs, they look great. It's just a story for me that just like kind of plods along. Like I think they could have made it a lot more tighter in terms of the plot itself. That's the only problem I have with it. Like I like the concept of it. I like the look of it. I just think the actual script, the story of it, it plods along. To me, it kind of gets boring.
Fair enough, fair enough. Another honorable mention I would say would be the 90s version of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, known as Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. I actually really dig that one. It didn't make my list, but that one I think is really good.
Yeah, I think I enjoy it too, especially if you're really into like the whole mecha aspect of Godzilla in terms of like the ships and the weapons and like the robots. It's like that's like a mecha head's like dream movie because it's got so much cool machinery in it.
I also really like Godzilla vs. Destroyer.
Yeah, that's a good one too. That's an interesting film. I think there's parts of it that really work and other parts that don't really work, but it was an interesting way to sort of bring it full circle with the original film, with the whole Oxygen Destroyer and
Emiko makes an appearance in
absolutely. That. So yeah, I think to me it doesn't always work, but I also think it was another one of those ones where they really tried to go outside of the comfort zone of what a Godzilla movie was expected to be.
I also, this is a controversial one, but it's one I've always enjoyed, is Son of Godzilla. I really like that one.
That's another one. I feel it's kind of like that mid-'60s kind of doldrums of the Godzilla films.
Listen, you like Godzilla's Revenge, so you can't talk.
That is true, that is true. But I liked was Kumanga? The spider? Yeah, that's a cool one. That's a creepy, that's definitely
although in my VHS dub of the movie, they call him Spica.
Right, mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, that's a scary looking. It's like really realistic looking spider too, man. It's pretty creepy.
Yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed both our list, and let me know what some of your favorite Godzilla movies are. Now, because the new Godzilla film is coming out, like, at the time we're recording this, I have not seen it yet, but by the time this video is up, I probably would have already seen the movie, and right after this video, I'm going to do reviews on the 3 anime Godzilla films, then I'm going to do a review on Godzilla King of the Monsters, the most recent American Godzilla film. So stay tuned for those reviews, and bye.